I think it's very much so vibes-based politics when it comes to people like Kamala Harris when they're talking about prices in itself. It sounds really good, So the government is going to intervene and step in and ensure that you don't have to pay that much for your groceries. Zara Sultana and a couple of other Labour MPs said that we should nationalise Ticketmaster. And again, it's all just sort of vibes-based policies.
Because what we've got is essentially development is banned. You own land, you're not allowed to do anything with it unless you get permission from the government.
Welcome back to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast with me, Reem Ibrahim, the IEA's Acting Director of Communications. Today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, the IEA's Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, the IEA's Editorial Director. We bring you a current affairs podcast with a difference. We want to go beyond the headlines and instead focus on the big ideas and foundational principles that matter to classical liberals. Today we are going to be discussing how Oasis and Kamala Harris have brought about some of the best discussions around price controls, trade unions, and why we still haven't solved the housing crisis. Tom, would you like to kick us off with the first topic?
Yeah, sure. So this week, the Competition and Markets Authority opened an investigation into Ticketmaster online ticketing platform over their dynamic pricing of Oasis concert tickets. It's the same week that American presidential candidate Kamala Harris seemed to attribute high American grocery prices, and having spent some time there this summer, I can tell you they are exceptionally high, but she put it down not to general inflation, but to price gouging. Now, on the narrow issue of whether Ticketmaster misbehaved in the way they handled the Oasis ticket sales, I have an open mind on this, right? So I think what a lot of people were very upset about is that they waited in an online queue for hours. They finally got to the front of the queue and found that the ticket price had spiked massively without warning, and they had only a few minutes to decide whether to buy the tickets or not. Now, I've not got a huge problem with consumer protection authorities looking into something like that. I think you can argue that regulatory intervention maybe isn't needed, shouldn't be needed in a competitive market. But this is not something that I'm going to get super upset about them taking a look at. I think the broader question, though, is the interesting one here. Both of these stories seem to signal to me something we've talked about here before, actually, which is that consensus that I think we had for years, if not decades, around government control of wages and prices being a very bad thing with significantly negative economic consequences, seems to be falling away. And one of our former colleagues, Ryan Bourne, who's at Cato now, has edited and put together a great book called The War on Prices, and he's identified this as a kind of growing and sort of wide-ranging theme in political discussions at the moment. And what really worries me about it, actually, is that so-called neoliberal consensus that emerged in the 1980s and sort of defined economic debate, although we can argue over the extent to which it really was as dominant as some people say. Lots of that has sort of fallen by the wayside or been watered down over time. But I think the one thing that really endured, the central insight, was that you had to let markets set prices. You had to let prices be a function of supply and demand and consumer preferences, partly because prices embody really important information and really important incentives, but also because if you don't do that, you just get an absolute mess. And so however social democratic you want to be, however much redistribution you want to do, however much tax or regulation, that's all one thing that we can disagree with. But when there was this shared agreement that prices were in some sense sacrosanct, that was where the market operated, even if you had very left-wing views on everything else, I think we were ultimately in an okay situation economically, in the sense that the bounds of political debate were such that it could only be so bad. Now, if we're really getting back into an era where prices are something that should be politically set or politically influenced, I think that's very dangerous. That could possibly spell a really dark turn economically. And so I think interesting things that maybe we can talk about. First of all, how much is that actually a real problem? Am I overreacting? But secondly, what do we do about it? How do we try and get, if you like, Milton Friedman's price theory to rise in prominence again, and for people to think more like economists and maybe, as in so many things, less like lawyers.
Well, indeed.
Yeah, well, there was definitely a time when the issue of price controls came up. You were able to rely on some left-wing economists also saying, no, this is a bad idea. Some left-wing economists also saying, I'm on your side generally, but don't do this. And that would, of course, help our side, because then we could say, look, it's not just us baddies. It's not just us, the awful neoliberals who say this. Here's one of the good guys, and they say this too. And now that everything has become so tribalized, I guess left-wing economic commentators are more reluctant to do that. So specifically in the US context, because this could then be seen as an endorsement of Donald Trump, because his side has, of course, been going on about how once the Kamala side brought up, the Democrats, once they brought up price gouging, price controls, they said, oh, well, this is communism. And now if you're a center-left economist, you have the problem that if you come out full swing against price controls, you are, at least on this one narrow issue, on the same side as the Donald Trump campaign. Where, of course, if that is their worry, what they could do is simply say, to try to appear even-handed, they could lump this together with the Trump side saying, this announcement that they made that a tariff is a tax on a foreign country, and you could attack that in the same breath, and in that way you can say, well, both sides are in a way ignoring the Econ 101 textbook, and there's a lot of bad economics on both sides, but that doesn't seem to be happening right now.
It's interesting. I think it's very much so vibes-based politics when it comes to people like Kamala Harris when they're talking about prices in itself. It sounds really good. We all agree that, groceries are incredibly expensive over in the US, and we all feel the cost of living crisis. So the government is going to intervene and step in and ensure that you don't have to pay that much for your groceries. Similar thing with Ticketmaster, where Zara Sultana and a couple of other Labour MPs said that we should nationalise Ticketmaster. And again, it's all just sort of vibes-based policies. It's these kind of notion that actually I'm doing something, I'm on the good side, without actually considering what the impact and what the implications of such policies could actually be. And what I think is really interesting about this is actually that prices themselves communicate information to consumers, and it's exactly the reason why every consumer doesn't need to know absolutely everything about the particular product that they're buying. They are sort of in many ways rationally ignorant as to what, how much supply of cocoa beans there are, for example. And, if the price of chocolate increases, they can then actually, understand that there is that particular difference in supply without having to know all of the intricate details of that particular supply difference or supply change. So prices are so important at communicating that information to consumers. As soon as the government intervenes and controls prices, if we're talking about it in the most extreme circumstances, that has a huge impact on supply chains. Tom, could you talk a little bit about what the implications of price controls actually could be?
Well, let's focus on the dynamic pricing question first of all, I guess, because there's two different types of dynamic pricing that are maybe relevant to consider. One is the kind that Uber and other ride-sharing apps use, which if there's a spike in demand, then the price will go up. What happens when the price goes up? Well, it tends to attract more supply immediately. So more drivers either stay out on the road or they come on and start driving around, they pick people up. So what it means is you can still, if you need an Uber and you're prepared to pay the higher price, get one quickly. If you're prepared to wait a while, there'll probably be a supply response and prices will fall again. Now, when Uber first kind of became a big thing, this was quite controversial. I think it's telling that people don't talk about it very much anymore, because I think Uber realized the problem was not so much, at least from public perception standpoint, the surge pricing. It was the lack of transparency, and it was people being surprised by the eventual price that they paid. So they did the thing where it would say prices are higher, but it'll tell you what the price of your ride was going to be, and you agree to it in advance. And so I think kind of the heat has gone out of that form of dynamic pricing a little bit, and that's certainly to be welcomed. The other kind of dynamic pricing, though, is the one that's on display with this Ticketmaster and the Oasis concert tickets, which is basically where you have a fixed supply of something and you're trying to get the best price for it. Now, as an economist, you would say you have a scarce resource and you want to make sure that it ends up in the hands of the people who value it the most highly, and that's expressed by how much they're willing to pay. It's kind of like auctioning something in a way, except you're doing it normally online through an algorithm, and the price is adjusting relative to demand, so you get the highest possible price. Of course, most people wouldn't see it that way. They would just say, but it's so unfair. Why should someone who isn't as rich not be able to go and see their favourite band or something? Airlines do it. You see it in travel a lot as well. But this is one of those classic sort of economic arguments again, right? It's the Bastiat, what is seen and what is not seen. And the bad economist focuses on the seen effects, doesn't consider the unseen ones. Now, even when you're kind of dynamically pricing something that's sort of fixed in supply, and so effectively it's just the price that is going to vary, well, you might not get an immediate supply response, but it does send a powerful signal. In this case, it tells Oasis that there is a heck of a lot more money to be made than maybe they originally thought by doing some extra gigs. And I think they added some extra gigs.
Yeah. So the supply is not completely fixed.
So the supply is not completely
Oasis
fixed.
is not totally inelastic.
I mean, we'll see. But yeah, so even then, if you think about flights, for example, flights spike in price in the school holidays. This is well known. Now, on the one hand, that's actually good for people who don't have children, or who can leave them with grandparents and travel during term time or something instead, because they benefit from lower off-peak pricing rather than just paying a sort of average price over the course of the year. That's one of the unseen effects that would be lost if you got rid of the dynamic pricing. The other thing, again, if travel companies, if airlines, if everybody knows that there is a lot of money to be made in these peak periods, then over time you would expect supply to be higher than it otherwise would have been. And so these are examples of this modern algorithmic dynamic pricing in effect. But ultimately, it's the same kind of argument that applies to market pricing in general. You have a short-term kind of sense that you're trying to bring supply and demand into equilibrium, and that's a good thing. You also have a longer-term thing where both demand and supply will adjust according to the realities of the world and consumer preferences and potential demand and entrepreneurial opportunities to make money. And this ultimately is how free market capitalism works. If you start undermining those price signals, if you try and dampen them down altogether, and even if it's at the start just for the very benign reason that you want people to be able to go and see Oasis, that's a very dangerous road to walk down. But I'm also struck by something else that you kind of brought up in your question. You're talking about vibes-based politics, and that's true. I kind of see that. But I also wonder the extent to which so much of what we talk about on this podcast and with this topic in particular is just the inability of modern governments and modern politicians to say, actually, this has nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
Like, I don't like this. This seems unfair. Maybe Oasis should do some more concerts or whatever, right? But they can't do it. Politicians today cannot say, I'm sorry, I feel your pain. But economics is reality, and this is not something we should be involved in.
It does seem to be the case that the government and all politicians want to be seen as though they are doing something about any problem, any given problem. They want to be seen as though they are contributing to the solution, even when it comes to things like, a very, very popular band getting back together, or indeed something a little bit more, I suppose, essential, which is food, and actually saying that, we are going to be doing something about increasing prices in food and inflation. The problem is that the economic reality of price controls on food would be disastrous. I mean, we've seen it happen across various different countries that have implemented some kind of intervention in controls on the price of food, and what you end up with is, in many extreme circumstances, famines. You end up with huge supply shocks, and so what ends up happening is production slows down. There are various you're effectively changing the incentives for different production and supply chains, and so you end up with the reality, which is often scarcity and often increased amounts of poverty as a result. So, the economic reality of controls on things like food or on price controls in general is usually quite dire, and I think that argument isn't made nearly enough.
Even, by the way, in the most kind of even where people are able to make the most compelling case for price control, say in a pandemic or a natural disaster where they don't want people profiteering on others' misery, that seems quite compelling morally, but I still think economically speaking, it's wrong, because what is that so-called price gouging doing? It's showing that there is an enormous incentive to try and get supply into that problematic region or into that disaster as fast as possible to capitalize on that demand that's there. And I mean, this is trivial, but I remember during the pandemic, I lived in was living in central London, there was a corner shop nearby which was amazingly well stocked at all times, and all of the shortages you heard about, like the no eggs, no toilet paper, whatever. These guys, I don't know how they were doing it. And yes, clearly they were charging sort of top dollar, but they never ran out of everything. And they managed to find all of these weird and wonderful different suppliers, seemingly, stuff with foreign labels, weird little pasta shapes that I'd never seen before, and obviously had been sitting in reserve somewhere waiting for something like this to happen. But it was precisely because they could charge those prices that they were able to continue supplying stuff that we needed. I'd much rather have had that than government saying prices are set, start cutting up newspaper.
Well, indeed. Maybe if they had the incentive to, right? That particular shop wouldn't have done that if it wasn't for the fact that they were able to charge higher prices.
And in principle, you could have had the same situation with Oasis ticket prices. If they had said, if Ticketmaster or whoever the platform is, if they had said right from the start, we're setting a price of £400 or so, then say somewhere a market clearing price where it never fully sells out, then you wouldn't have had this online waiting time. Then you would be able to say, I'll buy my ticket 2 days before it starts. That would always have been a possibility. What happened in this case was simply that they vastly underestimated how popular this was going to be. And for good reason. It now seems obvious that we think, obviously half of the country wants to see Oasis, apparently. But that was not obvious before, because if a band hasn't been playing for 15 years, you can't just assume that if they regroup, that old magic is going to be revitalized. It could well have happened that the fans have simply moved on. They've forgotten about it. It's not a big deal anymore. And it could have been a total flop. A lot of comeback tours are flops. And in this case, I think there was just this massive difference between actual demand and anticipated demand, and that's why this gap between the price that was initially set and the dynamic price that eventually resulted on Ticketmaster was so massive. But of course, that's an unusual situation, and say even if the price, if there had been some restriction on dynamic pricing. Okay, the tickets would have sold out within 5 seconds, but there would have been dynamic pricing of a different sort, which is on the secondary ticket market. The only difference is that now they've brought it in-house. The primary market and the secondary market were sort of merged into one. That's the only difference here.
It's very interesting. And also the discussion around tickets itself and whether or not they are your property and therefore you're allowed to resell it. Or indeed, if actually you enter into a contract where you've promised and effectively said that you're not going to resell the ticket, which means that you obviously even can't give it as a gift, apparently, according to that. It's interesting from a classical liberal perspective what the morality of both.
Yeah, I think if some very public-spirited band wants to set a low price and assign their concert tickets by lottery or something and have restrictions on reselling, saying, you have to show ID to be admitted, the name is on the ticket, that's fine by me. This is all part of the kind of the richness of free market life. You can take all of these different options and, through the discovery process of competition, people will work out what's best. And there's never one best answer. Different things will be best and most appropriate in different circumstances for different bands with different fan bases and so on. But fundamentally, this is not something that the government should be trying to control or impose a single view on. And I think that's an unjustifiable point.
I think a band like that would not even have to be exceptionally public-spirited. It could just be that... So I read about how, it could be totally wrong, but I read somewhere that Bruce Springsteen used to do it in that way, that he used to sell tickets for much less than the market price that he could have charged, or at least a portion of them. And his assumption in doing that must have been that that willingness to pay is not a good indicator of the extent to which you're a true fan. So he must have thought, I have lots of low-income fans. They are not going to be able to pay the market price if it's purely set by supply and demand. But they are nonetheless the most passionate ones, and I want some of them in the concert, and that makes it a more enjoyable experience, maybe even just for him. And that could be that's a perfect rational consideration.
An arena full of 55-year-olds who just want to sit there and observe the music is probably not the atmosphere Bruce Springsteen is going for. So,
well, indeed, but at least we know for certain that in a free market we have all of these wonderful options to choose from. Moving on to the next topic, so. We published a book this week by Professor Len Shackleton called Unions Resurgent, the Past, Present and Uncertain Future. And effectively, what the book looks at is sort of the history of trade union relations in the United Kingdom, which, as we are all very much so aware, it has been very, very difficult, and they seem to have had huge amounts of control, especially in the period around the 1970s, before the Winter of Discontent in 1979. Now, what's really interesting about the book is it sort of comes just as the government are considering increasing trade union power. What I think is really interesting about unions itself is that, traditionally speaking, people on the right usually tend to be anti-union, or they are expected to have a perspective that is anti-trade union. But actually, from a classical liberal perspective, the right to freedom of association is one that all of us would very likely uphold. The point is that trade unions have lobbied the government for special privileges, which means that, for example, they are able to take all of their members and withdraw their labour, and they are not allowed to employers are not allowed to end employment as a result. So there are huge swathes of effectively sort of lobbying groups that the trade unions have done, and it means that actually in the public sector there are huge numbers of trade union members. So trade union membership has actually declined significantly over the last few years. So at the moment in the public sector, 49% of workers are union members compared to just 12% in the private sector. And the predominant reason for that is in the private sector, if you don't like your job or you're not happy with your employment standards or your working conditions, you probably have another option to leave. And so if you were working in one comms job at one company, you can go to another company and move. In the public sector, you don't necessarily have that choice. If you are a junior doctor working for the National Health Service, you could go to the private sector, but the NHS is such a huge monopoly and is where most patients would be. So what's really interesting is that actually unions by nature are one of the only ways that members, the trade unions and members of the public sector workers are even in the first instance able to negotiate, because effectively their employer is the taxpayer, their employer is the government, and striking is one of the only ways that they have that kind of ability to withdraw their labour and negotiate.
Well, they also vote. And public sector workers do make up an enormous share of the working age population in the UK and therefore of the electorate. So I don't know if I wouldn't see it as quite as black and white as you do in terms of a sort of pro-public sector union argument. I think you can actually make the opposite argument, maybe, that because the public services are in some sense under democratic control, there is a weaker case from a classical liberal standpoint for unions in the public sector. I'm not going to kind of pursue that argument to its logical conclusion necessarily, but I think it's sort of complicated there. But the broader point is well taken, that I don't think that people on the right or on the free market side or classical liberals should be instinctively, reflexively anti-union. I think that's a big mistake. I think that unions historically probably offered a lot. I think in the future they could offer a lot as well. And one of the things Len talks about in the book is unions sort of rediscovering that historic Victorian role of sort of acting for mutual benefit, sort of a friendly society role, providing benefits like health insurance and unemployment insurance and sort of non-workplace negotiation sort of benefits. And I think that, that's great. And I think that could become more and more important as the fragility and fiscal unsustainability of the post-war welfare state becomes more apparent. But I think, ultimately, classical liberalism and free market analysis, what it's often about is about kind of identifying unearned legal privileges that allow people to rent seek and trying to remove them. It's easy to mischaracterize classical liberalism as something of the boss class and something for the capitalists. And I'm not sure that's true. It certainly wasn't true historically. It shouldn't be true in the future. And I think you can look at trade unions, particularly at those kind of high watermarks like the 1940s and the 1980s, right? Also the 1970s, and say these guys were massively exploiting legal privileges that they'd been given, which are not an appropriate part of a free society.
And I think any classical liberal would actually say that, it's bad when trade unions lobby the government for special privileges, and it's bad when businesses lobby the government for special privileges. It's bad in all cases, and we have to be consistent on effectively what is right and why it is wrong to sort of actually take advantage of those legal privileges and lobby the government for them. And what it means, it does distort the market. It means that the labour market is distorted, and there are international examples of trade unions doing exactly as Tom said. I mean, Sweden, for example, is not one of the most sort of free labour markets in itself, but Sweden doesn't have a minimum wage, and trade unions don't want one because effectively trade unions and employers negotiate freely without the government intervening. In that one respect, it was one of the exemptions that Sweden had when they entered the European Union. And also the legal allowance of snus, which I wish we had here. But what's interesting about that is that you can have a society in which trade unions do play a really important role, and they don't just strike. I mean, they also provide sort of legal support. I think for many teachers, actually, it's really important for them to have that legal support, which effectively means they don't have to pay out of pocket for lawyers if they were to ever need it. And there are these very brilliant privileges and sort of friendly society benefits that you get from trade unions. But what's really interesting about the book is looking at it historically. Actually, when the government started intervening, when trade unions began to gain these special privileges, that's actually where we saw a lot of these problems. And indeed, in the public sector, it is incredibly difficult to do so. Now, looking towards the future, if the government are to give even more sort of special privileges to trade unions, we would see A, higher taxes, but B, effectively huge amounts of disruption in the public sector and not much sort of legal headway to do anything about it.
Yes, so I hope one of the misunderstandings that this book is going to clear up is this idea that being on the pro-market side means being anti-union. I'm sure you've had this several times when there was a big strike going on, that somebody in the media would get in touch with you and they would want you to come on a show and represent the anti-strike, anti-union side, even though you haven't said a word about it. They have no way of knowing where you're going to stand. They just assume IEA means free market, means anti-union. And what this makes clear is that in principle, a trade union is just another civil society organization, no different in principle from a tennis club. And in that way, to expect a free market here to be per se anti-union or pro-union for that matter would be like saying, I'm per se anti-tennis club. Well, whatever the tennis club does, I'm always against it. It is really just a matter of, do they receive any special privileges? There was a time when they clearly did. And yes, you can find quotes from free market economists from the 1970s that sound very anti-union, but that was always made in that particular context when trade unions had coercive powers. And that's what this is about. But you brought up Sweden with the trade unions there being defensive of their autonomy, and for that reason, well, quite liberal. That tradition of liberal trade unionism existed in this country too. That's one of the things that this book also discusses, and that I didn't know before, that there was a time when at least a section of the trade union movement was, they wouldn't have called themselves classical liberals. They might even have rejected that label, but they were in practice protective of their autonomy, and they wouldn't have wanted the government to legislate in areas where they thought, this is our job, this is our business, leave us alone, we will sort this out. And that tradition seems to have been lost, that quasi-liberal trade unionism.
It has indeed. I think that actually looking to the future, that is the sort of society in which trade unions are able to negotiate freely with employers. The problem is, of course, as Len talks about in the book, when the employer is the government, and when the employer and all of that money is coming from taxpayers, effectively public sector pay has to be seen in the context of public sector spending, which we are all very much aware of the fact that public sector spending is pretty astronomical at the moment. And so thinking about public sector pay in that context means that actually trade unions that represent public sector workers have to compete with other budgets. So they have to compete in principle with sort of the defence budget or the budget on education. So what that means is that there is that kind of sort of competitive nature within public spending itself. And so one of the only ways that they can actually sort of have any kind of negotiating lever is by striking, is by withdrawing their labour. And Tom mentioned the fact that they are all voters. I think that what's interesting is that, this sort of assumes that voting in itself would necessarily affect the change that they would particularly want, or indeed that the government should listen to the preferences of particular sectors or particular workers. I think it's a very timely book, and definitely one that will continue to be important as trade unions improve.
And just on that note, one of the problems here is that trade union discourse or discourse about labour market conflicts is still a bit stuck in the 1980s. And that's one of the things that this book also makes clear, that we think when there's a strike going on, this is somehow about the workers getting together, defending their collective interests against the rich, fat cat capitalists. And most of the time nowadays, it isn't like that. It's not the coal miners versus the owners of a coal mine. It would be public sector unions who are in effect paid by the taxpayer. So even though this book is not anti-union in any shape or form, but it is unsentimental. And it makes it clear that this trade union romanticism that's still dominant on large sections of the left isn't really warranted anymore.
Most of them are university educated and professionals. So actually, our idea of what trade unions are today are very, very different to what they actually were back in the 1970s. Here's to hoping that we don't see a similar sort of winter of discontent as of 1979. Let's move on to the third topic. Kristian, you're going to talk to us a little bit about a book that you rediscovered from the IEA.
Yes, that book is No Room by Alan Evans, published originally in 1988. And I discovered this here in one of the archives. Coincidentally, I was looking for something totally unrelated. And this can happen in our archives. We have lots of old treasures, and sometimes you start reading things and you get lost in it. But most of the time, the charm of these older publications is that they take you back to a different era. They take you back to a time when things were done in a completely different way, and it feels like you're traveling through time. In this case, what was strange about it was that you could easily forget that this is a book from 1988. It felt over long passages that, as if it had been published last week. And that's a bad thing. It's great, of course, that we can say our publications tend to age very well. But what this shows simply is also that the problem, it's about the housing market, that the problem hasn't been sorted out. If anything, it got massively worse than it was in 1988. And that's the reason why it aged so well. But part of the point that I want to make by republishing this with a new introduction is, I guess it's a form of hipsterism, right? I'm not trying to say we were YIMBYs before it was cool. We already did this in the 1980s, long before YIMBY was even a word, or even NIMBY, I think. That wasn't used at the time. So we were there before. But also by republishing an old study rather than writing a new one, you can also show that it was possible to know about those problems as far back as 1988. So by definition, this publication is completely free of any kind of hindsight bias. You can't accuse the author of, doing what we do. We know what the problem is. And we can project that back in time. We can say, why didn't they do something about this in the 90s? Why didn't they do something about this in the 2000s? To us, it's obvious that the problems were already building up quite a while back. It was not automatically obvious to this author writing this in the late 80s. And yet it was possible to come up with an analysis that is still broadly true today. And I've given talks as part of our school's outreach program. I've given talks on the housing crisis. I usually include that in the literature recommendations when I tell them here's a couple of things that you should read if you're interested in the housing crisis. I include that despite its age, and that's really quite telling.
And what's sort of the central thesis? Like, what does he identify as the big problems which, at the time, he was saying these are going to lead to precisely the kind of housing market issues that we face today?
Well, he just starts with the observation that land prices for agricultural, non-residential land have been pretty much flat the whole time. If anything, they were falling in real terms, whereas it's only residential land. That's where you see a price explosion. And the gap between the two, agricultural land, residential land, grows bigger and bigger over time. And he says, well, in any kind of halfway functioning market, surely you would expect some reallocation going on there. If land of one type is super abundant, as signaled by the prices, if land of another type is extremely scarce, as again signaled by the prices, why don't we reallocate some of the abundant type of land to the purpose of land use that is in extremely high demand, where the scarcity is? Because surely that's what we would do in any other sector. If there was suddenly, say, a shortage of beer, but you had an oversupply of tea using hops, then you would use some of the hops, take them out of the tea sector and use them for the brewing sector and reallocate them that way. Why does that not happen in the land market? Why do we not see any reallocation? It's quite clearly it's the bureaucratic restrictions. It's not allowed to happen. It's not that the developers don't want to build or that the farmers don't want to sell their land. Of course they do. They could become millionaires overnight by selling a parcel of land to a developer, and then they could retire and be rich. And if that doesn't happen, clearly something must be obstructing it.
Yeah. And the planning system itself is, in the UK, one of the most restrictive in the world. Effectively, it means that the government are artificially restricting the supply of housing, of residential properties. And of course, we know, it's sort of is economics 101, that if the supply is restricted, then prices do rise. And so the problem politically, I think that's really interesting about this is looking towards the future. There is sort of an element of the fact that the government seem to want to solve the housing crisis, seem to, harp on about how important it is that we build more homes. And I think the Overton window has shifted in that way.
Yes.
But do you feel optimistic about the fact that potentially, this is a very bad question to ask you.
I never feel optimistic about anything. But
do you feel optimistic about potentially these policies impacting the housing crisis and indeed actually us building more?
Well, there is a lot happening. So the YIMBY movement, when that started, the end of the last decade, it was maybe 24 urban planning nerds. It was really not a thing beyond that. It has now reached a stage where you can describe it as a movement. It is a political force, a weak one. It's not a match for NIMBYism yet. NIMBYism is the dominant force still, but there is another side. And that's been the problem the whole time, that it wasn't, like a situation where you have, you could imagine a situation where one party tries to win the NIMBY vote and another party tries to win the YIMBY vote. But that didn't happen so far because there was no YIMBY side. There were, of course, people complaining about the housing situation. That's been a thing for as long as I've lived in this country. That's always been a topic of conversation. But I've always noticed that the people who are negatively affected by the housing shortage, whether that's because they want to buy, or whether it's just them complaining about the rental situation, or they're on a social housing waiting list, whatever, they never seem to think in supply and demand terms. For them, it's something that just somehow happens. And if you don't think about the causes, then that means you're not going to become a political force. You're not going to support policies that might help with that problem, and you're not going to support a politician or a faction within a party which tries to address these issues. And that means these people, the YIMBYs in politics, are always going to be isolated. They have no support base to pander to. And then the NIMBYs and their own parties can say, well, look, you're just alienating everyone. Whereas we have people here who very actively demand to block housing. Whereas if we could lose some of the NIMBY votes, win YIMBY voters, that would be one thing. That would be a trade-off. But if that trade-off doesn't exist, if being YIMBY just means you alienate some people, you don't win over anyone, then it's not a politically viable option.
And in so many ways, there are similarities with our previous topic on trade unions in that the sort of NIMBY political cleavage has effectively been been captured by the government, and it means that those particular political incentives are being captured much more than anybody else's, even if in the long term the housing crisis continues to get worse and many of those NIMBYs are no longer with us, actually whether or not those changes will actually happen in the first place. It's also interesting just from a perspective of like sort of a new generation of young people that are just effectively unable to afford housing. And we know that since No Room, the crisis has gotten so much worse. I think in the 90s, the average house was about 3 to 4 times the average salary. And now it's more than 10 times, and in London, about 12 times the average salary. So we know that there is a huge problem here. We know that things have gotten worse since No Room. Why have those NIMBY political? Why has the political cleavage been further captured by the government? Why is it actually gotten worse since the 80s?
Well, I think there's a bit of a spiral effect here. That so when I started writing about housing and planning issues in the early 2010s, there was Nick Bowles. When he was housing minister, he was what you could call the proto-YIMBY. And he toured the country and talked about this, and he was quite evangelical about it. He was a true believer in his own way. It's just that he was isolated in his own party, and as I said before, there was the problem. There was no YIMBY vote, so he had no support base. And what happens then is that in that situation, a lot of the younger people who should naturally have been YIMBYs, they weren't following, most of them weren't following the day-to-day politics around this, but they did observe the consequences of the government siding with the NIMBYs. And those consequences were, of course, that you had spiraling housing costs, and also it contributed to the economic stagnation that we've had for such a long time now. So you had a lot of people, young and middle-aged people, who were negatively affected by economic stagnation, rampant house price inflation. They turned against the Conservative Party, blaming them, and not unreasonably, for those outcomes. And then on the Conservative side, they started to think, okay, the young people, they hate us anyway. Let's just retreat into our comfort zone, which is the NIMBY baby boomers, and let's pander to that segment of the electorate even more. And that's how, over time, the political right has become largely a baby boomer project. So there is basically no such thing as a young right winger anymore, and that was not the case in 2010.
Yeah, it's even more solidified those particular divisions, I think, as well, and it's sort of increased intergenerational inequality and also effectively, I think, just from this sort of the becoming a capitalist perspective, actually, if young people are no longer becoming homeowners by the time they turn 30, there was that old adage, if you're 18 and you're a liberal, you've got no brain. If you're 30, what is that game?
Yeah, I think you get
different versions of it.
Anyway, the point is that the sort of saying says that, by the time you turn 30, you normally become a conservative or you become a sort of capitalist. If people aren't acquiring property, then that isn't the case. And we had polling from the Fraser Institute I think it was last year, where effectively we saw that more than 53% of 18 to 34-year-olds believe that socialism is the ideal economic system. I don't see that changing unless young people are becoming property owners and are acquiring property and are becoming, sort of having that kind of stake in society. And so I think it has a long-term impact on actually the way in which ideologies, but even just the sort of perspective on whether or not the system is working. I think the housing crisis is such a good sort of microcosm for that, and in many ways the cause.
Yes, there have always been people on the Conservative side who said that as well as a kind of warning to their own side. Saying we can't just pander to the NIMBY votes because we need a new generation of either homeowners or at least people who can easily afford to rent and who for that reason feel that they are integrated into the capitalist economy, feel that it works for them. It's just the issue for them has always been they said this is going to become a problem at some point in the future, that these people, if they are excluded from home ownership and pay exorbitant rents, they will not grow out of their youthful socialism. But it always seemed as if that was in the distant future and nothing to worry about right now. What actually happened was that distant future became the present pretty quickly. It happened, gradually, then suddenly. And then you suddenly had this situation where the political right being almost exclusively a boomer project, giving up on the youth vote, basically, and just digging in. And even now, they're doubling down on the NIMBYism. It's just very hard for them to break out of that. Say, if you were a conservative YIMBY now, it's going to be infinitely more difficult than it would have been in 2010, because it means if you go against your established voters, your established supporters, you're not immediately going to win over new ones. It's not as if a lot of young people would suddenly say, oh, look, the Conservatives have changed. Suddenly they're a bit more YIMBY. Maybe I'll vote for them now. It doesn't work that way. You would really have to, they would have to keep doing it for quite a long period of time. You would have to see some results, ideally. That's when you might see a change. But how do they bridge that gap?
Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, the report we're talking about is from 1988. This is actually an even much more long-term problem than that, right? It goes back 75 years to effectively the nationalisation of development rights in the post-war era by the Attlee government. And I always think it's worth just reflecting on how unusual the British system is. It's almost wrong to call it a planning system, because planning, I mean, we don't like the term planning, but I think to most people, planning implies something quite benign, that you're going to make sure that there's roads and infrastructure to go along with new development. You'll make sure that it adheres to building regulations, perhaps that it's designed nicely and fits in with the local area. That's not really what the planning system is about. It would be much better just to call it a development control system, because what we've got is essentially development is banned. You own land, you're not allowed to do anything with it unless you get permission from the government. Okay, with a few exceptions, you can add a conservatory or convert your attic or that kind of thing these days, permitted development rights. But as a rule, you as a landowner are just banned from building on your land. And in the 1930s, we had an enormous building boom. We had huge shifts in the population moving around the countries during the Industrial Revolution. And those massive movements could easily be accommodated by increased supply of housing. By the way, a lot of housing which we still would regard as the most attractive and valuable and everything today, that was provided by the market. And again, in the 1930s, biggest building boom we've ever had. You had the Second World War, and then development rights were nationalised. It never recovered. And you had certain attempts to try and redress the shortfall in private house building, like a big social house building programme. The steam came out of that. Like the New Towns project, which I guess the government is talking about a revived version of now, building new towns instead of expanding or densifying existing ones. But we're really just trying to get back to what we had already. And if we just said, subject to certain common sense constraints, if you own land and you can profitably develop it and provide places for people to live and work and do all kinds of other stuff, why not? Why can't you do that? And that's the fundamental point behind all of this, is that the planning system is just bizarre. It's completely bizarre. Other markets don't work this way, and no wonder that this market is so deeply dysfunctional. And also I think it's a problem because it lies at the root of so much else. Okay, you can't get big agglomeration effects, which can be quite economically powerful, if you can't build up, if you can't build out. You can't get new growing industries if you can't provide them with the lab space and the technology or the energy supply or anything else. We have dug ourselves such a deep hole, and really for no good reason. This is just, it's crazy. It's crazy, and I hope that it's starting to change.
There are so many examples of effectively was like really quite silly completely rejections of permission. So there was one where a new movie studio was trying to build, and then they would just reject. The government just rejected it
in a disused quarry and landfill site. By the way,
so there's clearly no sort of economic value already there, and
or environmental or scenic or anything.
Yeah, I think also just on like climate-based policy, the green belt I think is a really good example of that, where effectively people seem to feel very passionately about protecting the green belt, despite the fact that a lot of it is not actually green, and a lot of it could definitely be freed up to build on. I think there was a stat that I saw last year where if we were to build on just 1% of the green belt, it would have such a measurable impact on the housing crisis. Why is the green belt, just before we finish up, why is the green belt and others like it so passionately defended by the NIMBYs?
Well, I think it was good luck for the NIMBYs and bad luck for us that it got this name, Greenbelt. It just sounds lovely. It's complete mislabeling. It's false advertising. I think it should be reported to the advertising, what's it called, the standards agency. That, I mean, there are Greenbelt equivalents, Greenbelt-like arrangements in some North American cities, but they call them urban growth boundaries. And that's a much less romantic name. It wouldn't make a great slogan, save our urban growth boundary. Whereas here, they had this romantic name, and that just became a bigger and bigger deal over time, which is why in my housing paper that we released earlier this year, where I talk about a hypothetical future where a government gets serious about solving the housing crisis, I think one of the things that my hypothetical government does is rename them, give them a more neutral, sterile name. I think renames them urban growth boundaries or something like that. In a way, Labour are now doing that. Well, not quite, but it would be the first step towards de-romanticizing them. And in a way, that's what Labour are now doing or trying to do by relabeling at least parts of them the grey belt. And that's a good way of just hammering home the point. It's not literally green. That's just a name.
A lot of it is brownfield sites.
And I think like everything else in political economy, basically, there are ideas and interests. And to have successful reform and successful liberalisation, you have to be moving on both at once, effectively. And so getting rid of the good PR that the Green Belt has, but more fundamentally getting this idea that the planning system is fundamentally wrong and peculiar and we don't need to have it. It's the ideas side. But then on the interest side as well, I think we have to grapple, and you talked about this with the growing YIMBY movement and the imbalance historically between the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs and how that might be starting to change. But we do have to think about the incentives that everybody has and the interests they have in the status quo and be clever about how we approach those. Because so many past attempts to liberalise or partly liberalise the planning system have failed, even when the ideas may have been there, or at least the ideas were better than what they would have been replacing, people didn't really get to grips with those deep-seated and powerful interests that were invested in the status quo and were resistant to change. Again, I hope that is something which is starting to shift. Note of optimism.
Note of optimism, friend on. Thank you very much, Tom and Kristian, for joining us today on the podcast. And thank you to all of you for listening. If you would like to receive physical copies of all of our publications, then do subscribe to IEA Insider, where you will see wonderful, wonderful content that you can't get anywhere else. Thank you very much for listening. And if you were interested in learning more about our new books and new publications and all of our research, check it all out on iea.org.uk.